Hey, what's up, everyone? I know it's been a while since the last time I've done a podcast, but considering that UFC will be the first major sports organization coming back after Rona season, I know a lot of new eyes they're going to be watching. So, wanted to kind of take some time, give everyone a primer as to what to expect. But before we jump into that, I want to introduce my guest for today's episode, Jebari. Well, you probably know more about yourself than I do, so feel free to introduce yourself, man.
Yeah, my name is Bryce. Actually the lead instructor at Hero MMA Academy. A two-time Sunday world champion, Sam Chow, from those who are more familiar with that term. It's actually kickboxing and takedowns. I'm an amateur MMA fighter.
Awesome. And just as some additional information, this dude's kicks are not fun to take at all. You know, getting kicked is never fun, but I can see people going out of their way to not even try to check your kicks, man, but just getting the hell out of the way. All right, so Jebari, man, before we jump into kind of what's going on in the world of MMA, do you just want to give us like a background as your MMA story as to like how you got into it? Because I know a lot of people are going to be tuning in for the first time next weekend. So obviously our stories are going to be a little bit different, but hey, maybe this inspires someone.
Alright, so to start all off, I've been practicing martial arts since I was 5. Started traditional martial arts, started with Kung Fu with Grandmaster Dennis Brown. You can look him up if you want to figure out who that is. But essentially, I've been doing martial arts my whole life. Eventually, as I got older, it's like I really wanted to test my skills. And like the best martial arts competition you could get into, properly test your skills to really determine if you could defend yourself in any situation is MMA. So that's the reason I got into it.
All right. Was there like a pinnacle as to like when you started? Because for me, it was essentially the first season of The Ultimate Fighter. For people who don't know, that's kind of like the reality show to get people into the UFC. It was season 1, and they were doing a marathon, and I was actually working in a restaurant at the time. And I started watching that marathon, and I liked what I was seeing so much that I actually called out of work that day to continue watching that entire marathon and then the fights later that night. And that kind of inspired me with MMA. What was that? Diego Sanchez, Kenny Florian, Stephen Bonner, and Forrest Griffin. Is there anything like that that happened for you, or not so much?
I mean, I guess I was watching MMA early on, like in the early Pride days, like occasionally. But for me, it's like I was always into like kickboxing and things like that. So MMA was kind of like, oh, that's where the best athletes are now. So that's what like really I mean, that's just what it is now. So I remember like I think the thing that really made me like, yeah, I definitely want to do MMA was like it sounds crazy, but like I saw Michael Page fight Bellator, I was like, holy shit. Sorry, but and I was like, holy snap. Yeah, that's exciting to watch. But I mean, I was always kind of into combat. I was always into fighting. I was always into, like, I would have went to kickboxing if it wasn't MMA. So, like, for me, it's like there was always, like, that path to full contact fighting.
Yep.
MMA is more complete.
Yeah, and I think that's a big stigma that, you know, I think would be wise for us to call out and all the people who might be tuning in for the first time next week is that MMA, in order to excel at mixed martial arts, you have to have a well-rounded game. The specialist doesn't really work at the UFC level. You know, like maybe Khabib Nurmagomedov, the lightweight champion, he's an exception to that. But you see a lot of these guys, they're accomplished kickboxers, they're accomplished jiu-jitsu guys, and they make it to the UFC and they either get their ass kicked or they never actually reach the pinnacle, which is holding a title. You know, like guys that pop into my mind, Demian Maia, you know, one of the best jiu-jitsu guys in all of UFC history.
Yeah.
And the guy could never capture that title. He'd be right there in the title fights, but he could never actually finish the job. And, you know, I think Bellator, which is a competing organization to the UFC, they bring in a lot of the accomplished kickboxers as well. And
they never excel.
Yeah, yeah.
Like Melvin Manhoff and like a few other people I can't name off the top of my head, but like they always seem to struggle. I mean, what makes MMA is the transition from fighting on the ground to going back to your feet to like going to the clinch to doing whatever, like that ability to transition immediately is what makes an MMA fighter an MMA fighter. As opposed to someone who just practices all these things separately.
Yeah, definitely. I think we're at like a weird point in mixed martial arts history right now where it's so easy to be well-rounded. Previously the information wasn't there and
Right.
you saw guys, oh, they were college wrestlers. What would they do when they get into the UFC? They would just go out there and wrestle people. You would see the
Right.
kickboxers, oh, they have 20 kickboxing fights. What happens when they show up in the UFC? They just kickbox.
Right.
Now you're actually seeing it balance out a little bit more. And like even if you look at the middleweight champion Israel Adesanya, obviously he had that
Right.
kickboxing background,
Mm-hmm.
but you're seeing him with some you're seeing him with some takedown defense now.
Right. I mean, yeah.
Typically those guys would get taken down and they would stay down or they'd be able to make it back to their feet and go immediately down right after that.
Right.
It would have been interesting to see if Yoel Romero would have actually tried to implement that wrestling game a little bit more. But, like he's the
Yeah.
champion for a reason. He's actually going out there working on his skills and he's becoming a more well-rounded fighter and even more deadly because now he doesn't have to worry about the takedown as much.
Right. Yeah. And again, on the Yoel Romero fight, like he also Yoel had even though Yoel is a world class wrestler, like Olympian wrestler, like we haven't seen him do a takedown in so long. But no one's really been able to hold his feet down anyway, so kind of like.
And that would be something that we probably want to call out to new viewers of UFC is that even though a guy might have credentials in a particular area, like they might be an Olympic-style wrestler, they might be a world jiu-jitsu champion, they might not actually implement that for whatever reason in the fight. And there's actually one on next week's card, Jacare Souza, that we'll talk about a little bit later. They don't actually play to their strengths as much as they should for whatever reason, but hey, that's their choice, I guess. But it kind of shows you that mixed martial arts, it's just not guys punching each other. There's a lot of skill involved with this game, and there's different aspects that you have to work on. Like if you compared this to a different sport, let's say baseball. If you're a pitcher in baseball, you have to worry about pitching. That's it. You can't do that in MMA. You can't just be like, oh, I'm going to be a striker. I'm just going to work on my striking day in, day out. Boom, you'll get taken down. You'll get submitted with ease. So it's definitely a grind. And from a training aspect, there's just so much more that you have to work on than other positions in other sports.
It's definitely way more demanding because as a former baseball player, I played outfield, but like that's literally all I did. I ran a ball down, I caught a ball, I threw it back in. But MMA is like you're constantly thinking, it's like, all right, I'm in this position. I'm like, all right, do I even know how to address myself, address my opponent in this position? Do I got to improve my position so I get to the point where I can like be offensive? So it's like it's a very different mentality. It's like you're gonna end up in a position you don't want to be in eventually at some point in your career, and you're just gonna have to work your way through it. So you have to be like a complete fighter to like really get through an MMA fight.
Yeah, and even with that being said, something that we might want to call out as well is that anything can happen in a fight. It's not like a football. It's not like a football game where like a team might lose like a 21-point lead. Like multiple plays had to happen for that upset to happen. In MMA, it could simply be a momentary lapse, and then you wake up not knowing where you are. And we've seen that even at the highest levels, like when Matt Serra with the spinning back fist on GSP. So for anyone who doesn't know, George St Pierre, arguably one of the best of all times, he was an extremely dominant champion. Went up against, I wouldn't say a scrub, but a very, very heavy underdog. And he just got caught with the outlandish spinning back fist, which isn't the most common of moves. And that ended his title reign and his like undefeated or his long winning streak. And it's just like literally anything can happen in a fight. And there's actually a guy on this card, Biggie Boy Rosenstrike, and his last fight against Alistair Overeem. What did that happen? He got knocked out with like.
Oh right, that was actually right. That was the hometown DC. But so it's like Overeem was winning the whole fight, then just clipped him with this.
It was like 10 seconds left in the last round, right? Yep. So
and left it open his lip and he couldn't continue.
This guy was getting his ass kicked for 24 minutes and 50 seconds, and then boom, a shot comes out of nowhere, and he ends up losing the fight. So anything can happen.
Hell, even like for me, 2 fights ago, I lost, and I was like. I felt like I was ready to go on the ground, on the feet, wherever, and it's like, and
Yep.
There are no second chances.
All right, cool. What do you think, Jebari? You want to jump into next week's fights?
No, let's go for it.
All right. So for anyone who doesn't know, next week is going to be the first UFC card in a little under 2 months, just because of everything that's going on with Corona. They've had to cancel it, and they're coming out with a bang. I would say that even though this card doesn't have Khabib Tony, which everyone's been looking forward to, this is probably one of the top 5 cards within the past year or so. Basically, what they were able to do is take main events from the cards that were canceled and put them on this card. So not only did they do that, but then they also threw in a title fight between Henry Cejudo and Dominic Cruz that literally came out of nowhere.
Yeah, I was like, I thought Henry was still injured. I was like, I thought Dominic was hurt.
Yeah, he's had, I think it's like 6 fights in the past 9 years. He hasn't fought in 4 years, and then he comes back to a title shot. So that literally came out of left field, but nevertheless, that's going to be an extremely interesting fight. But
yeah,
when we...
the last time Dominic Cruz fight was the last time Ronda Rousey fight.
Yeah, that's been a minute ago. That's been a minute.
Yeah.
All right, so what we'll do, we'll kind of break down each one of these fights, what we're thinking, and also I'll throw in my 2 cents in regards to betting. I know it's been a while since I've done the podcast, but I think it's fair to say that I'm still one of the world's best fantasy MMA players. To date, I've won over 20 DraftKings tournaments, so looking to add another one to my credentials after next weekend. But yeah, I'll try to hit this from a betting perspective just because I know sports betting's become extremely popular and there's not much out there right now, so I'm expecting a lot to happen in regards to betting with UFC. And even before this call started, I was telling Jebari about like where it's such a drought for betting. I've been betting on people playing video games over in Korea. So hopefully UFC is a little bit more entertaining. But yeah, if we want to jump into this card, our first fight, which is going to be on Fight Pass actually, so might want to call this out first, is that UFC cards typically happen on different formats. They'll either be on ESPN, ESPN Plus, pay-per-view, or UFC Fight Pass. I would never advise illegal streaming, but if you wanted to take that route, there's always streams out there that you can get access to all these fights without having to flip channels or paying. But like I said, I'd never advocate for it. I'm just saying that it exists. But
I don't do it at all. I support my fighters.
Okay.
I know too many pro fighters, so it's kind of like I get like they need that revenue, so it's like
Yep, gotcha. All right, so prelims are going to start on Fight Pass. First up, we have Ryan Spann and Sam Alvey. And Jebari, this is kind of a matchup between an up-and-comer with a lot of potential and Sam Alvey, who's kind of a gatekeeper to see if people are legit or not.
I don't really know anyone in the early prelims all that well.
Okay.
South Dakota versus gatekeeper. That could always go a few ways. I mean, that's always like obviously basically 50-50 shot, but it's one of those things. It's like, but I always tend to give it to the up and comer because I always a little bit hungrier. Yeah, they're just willing to finish the fight. I think I don't follow Sam Alvey too much, but if he stays technical, if he keeps pacing, where he keeps the fight, he'll come out with W. I'm assuming. But again, I don't follow any of the guys. Not that much. I'm a bad fan. More into the sport itself, not so much. I'm a bad fan.
No, I got you, man. So from my perspective, Spann is the biggest favorite on this entire card.
Gotcha.
Pretty aggressive, really aggressive, likes to finish his opponents, and Sam Alvey is a counterpuncher. For those who don't know, basically a counterpuncher, think of him as being reactive to what the other person is doing. So the other person, they'll throw a striking combo, then the counterpuncher is going to attack. Ryan Spann, really long, athletic, explosive guy, knockout power. I don't see this one going very well for Sam Alvey.
Right.
Just because he's an older guy, he's very he has a very strong knockout power in his left hand, but I don't see how this goes his way. I just think Span's going to pressure him, get him out there really early, and it should be a good win for an up-and-comer who actually gets a decent name under his belt with this one.
I see.
All right, next up we have Bryce Mitchell and Charles Rosa. Two extremely tough guys. Charles Rosa, he's based out of Boston, which is a very tough place. And then Bryce Mitchell, little known fact, he had his scrotum ripped off by a screw gun. I think that's what it was. Is that news to you? You still there, Jabari?
Hello?
Yeah, I'm still here. Jabari, you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
All right. Yeah, so...
I'm a little speechless on that one.
No, that's cool. I hit you with that interesting fact, and it might have stunned you a little bit, so you're good with that. This is a coin flip fight, and Vegas thinks the exact same thing. Bryce Mitchell, real good on the ground, but Rosa is as well. Bryce Mitchell actually hit, I think it was his last fight, or 2 fights ago, a twister, which is an extremely rare submission. I don't know. Haven't there only been 2 pulled off in the UFC's history? Something crazy like that?
Something like that.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's very interesting to see a guy from the South, which isn't exactly known as the biggest, country in the South, to actually pull off one of those intricate submissions. But, he was able to get the finish with that one. From my perspective, I think this is going to be a fun scrap just because they're 2 smaller weight guys. And typically the smaller weight guys, there's a lot more action than with the heavyweights and light heavyweights. So I'm not 100% sure where this fight's going to go, but should be entertaining nonetheless. What do you think of Jabari?
I don't know. I was thinking that he just may pull off a high-level jiu-jitsu move from an MMA fight. A lot of people don't realize that it is very difficult to pull off those high-level jiu-jitsu moves. Even the most common submissions, a rear naked choke with a guillotine or something like that. Even a arm bar can be kind of hard to pull off because there's sweat involved and the gloves add a different dynamic and everything else.
Yep.
It's I guess just to put in perspective, these guys know how to do techniques in MMA fights. That's very impressive.
Yeah.
You can punch somebody while they're on the ground.
Yeah, and my preference is actually to watch the smaller weight classes compete. Just because, like I said, you get a lot more action. You do get less finishes, but at the same time, I don't know, there's a couple fights that we'll talk on later in this card where there's a very high likelihood if it doesn't get finished in the first, these guys are just going to gas out, and for 10 minutes, they're just going to be like walking zombies throwing punches at, 20% of their power. But, yeah, this is definitely one of the better prelim fights just because I think it's going to be a lot of action. There's not a strong favorite. But, if an amazing finish came out of this fight, I wouldn't be surprised at all.
Right.
All right, next up we have what could very well be the most entertaining fight on the entire card. We have Vicente Luque against Nico Price. So sometimes when you're talking about MMA fighters, there are some guys with the mentality they are either going to kill or be killed. That accurately depicts both of these guys. They are all action fighters. They don't care about their well-being. They believe that they hit harder than their opponent, and they're willing to take a punch to give a punch. These guys have already fought, and I really enjoyed that fight as well, but both of these guys have evolved a lot since that last fight. Luque is the heavy betting favorite, but for me, with the mentality of these two guys, it's really a coin flip fight because I'm pretty sure someone's getting knocked out here. And I don't know who it's going to be, but like I said, both of these guys have amazing knockout power. They bring it. They have real good cardio. From a betting perspective, I'd put a lot of money saying that this one doesn't go the full 15 minutes. What do you think, Jebari?
No. I mean, if they're just going out there swimming for the fences, those are if they're both like that, well, one of two things going to happen is either going to be an early knockout or they're actually going to gas each other out. come the second and third round. They're going to gas each other out, and they're going to clinch quite a bit if they don't knock each other out immediately. And a lot of weight classes, I wouldn't put that past them. Even though they are lighter, they can go a lot further. They're not like the middleweights or the heavyweights where they like gas out immediately. It's like when you're putting out that much output, it takes a toll on your body.
Yeah, like I said, these guys, they heard about the research on CTE and they said they don't care. But yeah, if you're interested in watching next week's card and for whatever reason you have to miss the first couple of fights, this is the one that you definitely want to be in your seat for. If this won fight of the night, I wouldn't be shocked at all. It's two guys who go out there, give it their all, and you definitely have to respect them. And it's, like I said, it's just going to be fireworks the entire way through.
Yeah.
All right, next up, we actually go to the prelims that are going to be on ESPN and ESPN Plus. And it starts out with a very intriguing fight, Uriah Hall against Jacare Souza. You want to start off with that one, Jebari, or you want me to?
Yeah, I got it wrong. It's a little more dynamic than Souza. I mean, Souza is a veteran. He's a heavy hitter. Like, but Uriah Hall is a little more dynamic. I think he's going to find a weird opening. That's his thing.
So this goes back to what we previously talked about when we said that guys have all these accolades in a particular discipline, but for whatever reason, they fail to use them. So when Jacare first started out, that was his game plan. He would take somebody down, submit them. You know, he's a multiple-time world champion. It made sense. And what a lot of fighters start to fall in love with when they get their first knockout, or a really good knockout, they think all of a sudden that they can knock everyone out. And instead of taking people to the ground and doing what you are definitely better at than your opponent, they decide to stand on their feet. With Jacare, like I said, his fight IQ is very questionable. You know, Uriah Hall is a striker with crazy power, and he comes at you from really different angles. You know, like if we could play Uriah Hall's career back, and I know he's kind of gotten into his head a bunch, and he's had some anxiety problems, and maybe he didn't evolve the way that he should have. Uriah Hall definitely has the potential to be a champion if his career went a different way. Like, him and the difference between him and Israel Adesanya isn't really that much. It was just Israel came out the gate on fire, kept winning. Uriah, it just seemed like a couple early losses really got into his head, impacted him. But at the same time, he still has those physical tools to knock anybody out. And going up against...
And I think what does it for Israel, and not to cut you off, I think what does it for Israel is the fact that he has some kickboxing fights. He's been in the ring so often. Like just because you're the best fighter in the UFC, just because you're the champion, doesn't mean you're the best martial artist in the world.
Yep.
Most likely you are, but it's like that's not necessarily true. There are plenty of guys in the same gyms as these UFC guys who could tap these guys out anytime they want, or knock these guys out anytime they want. However, everything changes once you're like under those lights. A lot of people are like, oh, these MMA fighters look sloppy, this, that, and the third, and yada, yada, yada. I'm like, when you're fighting in your underwear in front of thousands of people, it's a very different feeling. Under the lights, like, different people shine at different moments. So it's like, one thing Israel Adesanya did that was really smart was he developed that kickboxing career, and he just had fight. He just got real comfortable with fighting. To the point where it's like, he's fought the most dangerous people in the world in kickboxing. He has no fear of anybody in UFC in terms of striking.
And it seems like that's the complete opposite with Uriah, you know, where Israel embraces the limelight. Uriah is actually hesitant to step in front of it. But with that being said, you know, like I said, he's an extremely dangerous striker. And if Jacare stands with him, there's a very big likelihood that he's going to get knocked out. But, you know, like I think if Jacare implements what he's best at, just going for those relentless takedowns, he could get the submission on Uriah. I think this fight is more dependent on Jacare's game plan than what Uriah is actually going to bring to the table. And Jacare, like, this is a guy who came out extremely strong. You know, we thought that he'd be the potential champion, and just a couple losses kind of got into his head. Now he thinks he wants to stand up. If that's the game plan that he wants to take, that might not be the best idea against a guy like Uriah Hall.
Right. Yeah, because you can tell Uriah Hall is like a very, very dynamic striker, spinning hook kicks and all types of not nonsense, all types of things that like most people can't even land.
Yeah, and it's not just flashy; it's effective as well. He does have some crazy highlight reel knockouts.
That's why I was like, let me not say nonsense. I'm like, no. He lands something. Be clear about that.
Yep.
And I think a big problem is Jacare doesn't like hide his striking behind his grappling, which is what a lot of grapplers do. It's like, okay, like for example, I'll land a double leg takedown. I'm not specifically a grappler, but I'll land a double leg takedown because people respect my striking so much to the point where it's like they'll forget that the takedown piece is there, so I'll go for it. And they don't even react to it. And a lot of people, that's like another aspect of the people don't realize. It's like, no, that transition is important. Knowing that everything is always a threat can change the whole nature of the game. That's like so many wrestlers knock people out because like a lot of people are worried about the takedown. Then the overhand comes and puts you to sleep because you're defensive takedown the whole time.
Yeah, definitely. And from a betting perspective, right now Uriah Hall is a slight underdog. I would actually throw some money on him just because, like I said, Jacare is the potential for him to lose is pretty high with this one if he decides that he wants to continue to fight the way that he's done the past few fights. Like maybe he proves us wrong, and that will give me something to think about the next time he fights, but I think he's going to try to stand with Uriah, and I think that's going to be a quick night because Uriah is going to knock him out relatively early.
Yep.
All right, next up we have the first, and actually this is the only women's fight of the entire night, Carla Esparza against Michelle Waterson. So this is kind of another similar story. Esparza, she's more of a grappler. Waterson, is she, she's karate, right?
Karate hottie.
Yeah, I didn't know if it was like a different discipline or not, but...
No, she's actually is like a karate practitioner.
Okay, all right. And then maybe what we want to do calling out this fight is that women's fights typically tend to go the distance. Outside of people named Cyborg, Nunez, or Savchenko. So expect...
Ronda, for better or for worse.
I purged her from my memory. That was a long, long time ago. Talking about people that are relevant.
Fair. I mean, she's got a lot to the sport.
Yeah, whatever.
Gotta pay homage, I'm sorry.
All right. So back to women that are actually competing nowadays. This is going to be an interesting fight. Esparza, she was actually the champion coming off of the Ultimate Fighter. Didn't they crown her the champion?
Mm-hmm.
Yep. And Waterson, she's been another person who has had a lot of hype behind her, and it's kind of hit or miss with her fights. She'll show up and look great, win that fight, and then other fights, it's like she fights down. When the competition isn't as high, that's when she tends to struggle. I don't know. I would give this one to Esparza, just given her grappling credentials. And Waterson, she's no slouch on the ground, but at the same time, I think Esparza has the strength and conditioning to just go for those takedowns late in the round and possibly win her some rounds. This is a coin flip fight in my mind, but if I had to bet it, it'd be Esparza. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not mad with that. I'm definitely on the top of this one, but history says the grappler tends to win in grappler versus striker. Typically. Not always. There's always exceptions to rules. Always find examples where that's not the case, but...
Yeah, if anything, if I had to bet for this fight, I would bet it going all 3 rounds just because, like I said, I'm not knocking women or anything. I'm just saying they don't possess the same knockout power for the most part that men do. And outside of those names that we already talked about, and then even then from a submission perspective, most of the time there's some strength involved there. The difference in strength between women doesn't seem as apparent as it is against their male counterparts. Like, if you see two guys, like a guy who's been grappling his entire life against a guy who has been a striker, that's going to be a significant difference in physical strength between those two guys. And women, I don't think it's that pronounced. Would you agree?
I would agree, because I think a lot of guys, especially guys that are grapplers, like, they're not just grapplers, they're wrestlers since they were like 5 in MMA. Yep. Especially since, like, wrestling doesn't have, like, a proper professional sport after college. It's like, wrestling since you were, like, 5, 6, 7, 8 years old, and then you go all the way through high school. Then you become a Division I wrestler in college, and then it's like, well, either A, go to the Olympics, or B, you find a job, or C, do MMA. if you really want to use your grappling skills, like wrestling skills from there. So it's like, I think that's it. So most guys who are striking, especially kickboxing, like you're kickboxing since you're like 19, and then it's like you're not like it's not like they're growing into like you didn't grow up. Chances are you didn't grow up a kickboxer if you live like in America. It's a little different in Europe. It's a little different in some parts of Asia, but it's like most of the world, like you don't grow up kickboxing. You may grow up boxing. If you grow up boxing, you box because there's no money in it. So if you're a striker in MMA, chances are you're either doing some traditional martial art where you really didn't have to manage your weight, or you really weren't focused on your strength as much, or B, you picked it up later on in life and you just kind of stuck with it. That natural strength is not there as much.
And I think that's a good segue into our next fight, which is up against two of the best grapplers in the heavyweight division. So Alexei Olynyk, I've always nicknamed him Oldhead just because of how old he is. But he's actually going up against Fabricio Verdum, who is the exact same age. I think Olynyk is like a month older than Verdum, but just to give you a backstory on this one. So Olynyk is a submission specialist to the T, which is very weird at heavyweight. When you think about heavyweight fights, you think about a lot of guys with crazy power who get a lot of knockouts. Olynyk is the complete opposite. He was actually the first to pull off an Ezekiel choke in the UFC from a guy who was mounted on top of him a couple of years ago, which was actually crazy. And I was actually pretty heavy into jiu-jitsu at that point. And that was the thing that we were trying to do, like immediately after that fight, seeing if we could pull off that Ezekiel choke from the bottom just like he did. But yeah, he's definitely one of the sport's best submission guys from a heavyweight perspective. But his opponent, Fabricio Verdum, is one of those guys who made his name in the jiu-jitsu circuit. So from an accomplishments perspective, Verdum is actually much more accomplished than Olynyk, and Verdum is actually a former UFC champion. He's been off for the past 2 years. I think it was banned substance suspension. Correct me if I'm wrong. But he's going to be making his return next Saturday. And like I said, even though he's a jiu-jitsu specialist, he's amazing on the ground, he does have some knockout power, and I think that's going to be the distinction between these fights. Typically, when you have two guys, they're the exact same discipline, exact same caliber. That particular discipline cancels itself out. So those two grapplers going up against each other, instead of being able to submit one another, those fights typically end up on the feet, and I think that's where Verdum has the huge advantage from this perspective. Verdum is currently the second biggest favorite on this entire card, and he's a guy that I am rolling with in all my DraftKings lineups. I think that it's going to be pretty easy work for him. He's going to get that knockout in the first or second round, but Jebari, I'll turn the mic over to you to let the people know what you think.
So right now, I'm trying to look at the last time Verdum lost, because I get it. He's an accomplished MMA fighter. He's been fighting since the Pride days, and I get that. But it's like, I'm always wary when I see someone focus solely on jiu-jitsu come back in MMA. And actually, his last fight was my long belt in 2018, which is
just that 2 year. Yeah, it's literally almost 2 years.
Yeah, but it's like that's not too long ago to the point where it's like I'm worried. But no, I would give it to Verdum too. He's just a more experienced fighter. And one thing you gotta be careful. One thing you always gotta be careful about with Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu guys, and I love Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. I have a blue belt myself. Shout out to Team Randori. But a lot of times they get so caught up in Jiu-Jitsu, they put themselves in positions that only work in Jiu-Jitsu. So it's like, oh, this is good with Jiu-Jitsu because they can't submit you, which you can get punched. And I've fought against people who have been like that. It's like, oh yeah, I'm going this position. Yeah, they're more experienced in Jiu-Jitsu than I am. But it's like, because they do Jiu-Jitsu so much, their instinct is to go into a particular position that's like, oh, I can just elbow you from here, or I can just punch you in the face from here. So the game is very different. But I would definitely give it to Verdum just because he's been fighting for so long. Yeah,
and I remember Verdum, he's a former champion. If you look at his losses, so it's Alistair Overeem twice, who we'll talk about in a little bit. No shame in that.
Right.
Stipe Miocic, which is the current UFC heavyweight champion,
Yep.
and Alexander Volkov, who could easily be a UFC heavyweight champion as soon as, I don't know, this next year. So it's all quality losses on his part. And like I said, you know, like if you are going to bet on a fight, I actually feel more confident on this fight than I do with Ryan Spann and Sam Alvey, even though Spann is the bigger favorite for that fight. But like I said, this is going to be, I think this is going to be a relatively quick fight. I think Verdum comes back big in this one.
Yep, I agree.
All right, next up, two pioneers of the sport, Anthony Pettis and Donald Cerrone. So just to give everyone some context on these two guys, Anthony Pettis, he's a former champion, used to be a really flashy guy. I'm not sure.
Remember that highlight reel with him jumping off the cage and Brown kicking the guy off the cage?
Yeah, that was Benson Henderson. For anybody who wants to check out one of the coolest strikes in mixed martial arts history, it's definitely Anthony Pettis against Ben Henderson, where he literally leapt off the cage to kick the guy in the face and knocked him down after that. I don't know if he fell down because it was a slip or the impact of the kick, but it was awesome nonetheless. And then moving on to his opponent, Donald Cowboy Cerrone. This might be the most storied guy in UFC history. You know, he's fought in the organization forever. Whenever they needed somebody to step in, he's stepped in. He's fought at multiple weight classes. And unfortunately, he was on his last fight, he was on the receiving end of a brutal knockout by Conor McGregor that stopped him really early. And Cerrone is a guy, it's hit or miss. He'll look incredible in a fight, and then the next fight, it will come out like he did against McGregor, where he just gets worked. And I think at this point, you know, his body has taken so much damage over the years that his chin's compromised, his ribs are compromised, his cardio gets compromised when but like I said, it's so hard to judge this guy because you don't know who's going to show up on fight night. He could come out and look like a
Cowboy's going to show up.
Yeah, I mean, right now, UFC has him as the ranked number 6 for the welterweight division. And we could be saying after this fight, man, this guy needs to fight for a title. He's looked so great. Or you could say, man, this guy needs to retire. He's just getting beat up all the time now.
Yeah, you usually go one way or the other.
And I have no idea with this fight. Because, like I said, Pettis does the exact same thing. Sometimes he'll look terrible when he comes up. Sometimes he'll look great. So these are kind.
I think they lose to last. I forgot who it was.
Who was that?
I remember he knocked out
Wonder Boy. Yeah.
And he knocked out Wonder Boy, but actually he lost to some. It was some weird loss. It wasn't Horace Masvidal. He didn't even fight Masvidal, did he? I can't remember.
Who are you talking about? Anthony Pettis' last fight?
Yeah, he lost his last loss. I forgot who it was.
So it was that knockout of Wonder Boy, and for everyone's context, Wonder Boy, he's an amazing karate guy, which no one expected Pettis to knock him out. And then he came back and lost to Nate Diaz. And then after that, Diego Ferreira. So Nate Diaz, very popular amongst the MMA space. Diego Ferreira, a good fighter, up-and-coming guy, but, you know, he's not that household name. So that was a very interesting loss for Pettis just because a lot of people didn't see that coming. I have no idea with this fight. It's going to come down to whoever shows up on fight night, and it's very well could be one guy shows up and then the other one doesn't. But
I think it's going to go the distance.
Yeah, I'm unsure, but I would lean Pettis just because I don't know. Yeah. And like I said, I don't think he's been compromised the exact same way Cerrone has. You know, Cerrone's always been notorious for being set back by when people strike his body. You know, you land one good leg kick to Cerrone's ribs, man, that might be the fight. And, you know, Pettis has always had pretty good fight IQ, so I think that he's going to put in a game plan as to try to tire out Cerrone relatively early on. But yeah, I definitely agree that this one goes the distance. But it's going to be an interesting fight nonetheless, just considering what both of these guys have done previously.
Yeah. You know, that's right. Okay. one thing always shocked me how big Cowboy was. Cause I think I met him back in like December, and I was just shocked that we were even like remotely in the same weight class.
Yeah, and I mean he fluctuates all over the place. You know, like he's done welterweight, he's done lightweight. Has he done 145 before?
I hope not.
You hope not?
I can't get to 145, and he's big.
Yeah, but that's going to be a pretty good way to finish off the prelims, and then after that, it's jumping into the pay-per-view component. And this is something that's actually going to resonate with maybe first-time viewers who are NFL fans. So it's going to be kicked off with Greg Hardy and Yorgan De Castro. So I don't think I have to say too much about Greg Hardy's past other than being a woman abuser. But in regards to MMA, he brings a level of physicality and athleticism that typically you don't see with UFC athletes. You know, Greg Hardy was a Pro Bowler, an All-Pro in the NFL, which is the best athletes in the world. Typically, you're not seeing those exact same athletes compete in the UFC. So when he first came to the UFC, he was just kind of blowing through guys with that power, that athleticism. And the thing that has always hindered Greg Hardy so far is his fight IQ. He has this thing for making extremely stupid decisions, one being against, who was it? Was it Alan Crowder? Where he was clearly a downed opponent and he kneed him right. Was it a knee or a kick to the face?
I don't remember.
It was a stupid decision regardless, and it was a fight that he was easily dominating. All he had to do was just keep striking this guy. The ref was seconds away from stopping the fight, and then for whatever reason, he decided to throw an illegal strike.
Right. Just so viewers may not know, though, in the UFC, you cannot kick a downed opponent. I think in one championship you can, but you cannot kick a downed opponent in the head.
Yeah, I think one, you can do pretty much everything that you want, though.
Right, yeah, one is basically pride.
I'm pretty sure the last time I saw one fight, they brought a steel chair into the ring and one guy got hit with it.
Yeah, one makes up their own rules, and one is fight field.
Yeah, but back to this fight. This one, I think this is going to end early. Both of these guys, they've never won by decision. Greg Hardy, he's got 5 knockouts of his 5 wins. Actually, no, De Castro does have 1 decision win, but together their wins. So we have Greg Hardy, he's got his 5 wins all by knockout. De Castro, 5 of his 6 wins by knockout, and then 1 decision. This one's going to be over relatively early on for me.
I mean, they're both 200 guys, they're both heavy hitters, they're both big guys. Like, it's not going to last long.
Yeah, and sometimes, you know, you have guys trying to prove themselves, I'm an extremely well-rounded MMA guy, and I think Greg Hardy tried to do that in his last fight against Alexander Volkov, which Volkov just picked him off with that. But I think now he comes back realizing, hey, if I want to pursue or excel in this division, I've got to come out there swinging. And, you know, it worked well for Francis Ngannou, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But I think both of these guys come out swinging, and this one's going to get ended in the first round.
And I'm all for like physical guys. Like, a lot of people don't like the people brawler types of like in MMA. They're like, it's the whatever, it's martial arts. But for me, it's like, no, like that's the skills that they bring to the table. I'm like, if they bring athleticism to the table, I think you should absolutely.
Yeah, and this is going to be a fight where if somebody wants blood or a quick knockout, this is definitely going to be the one to tune into. These guys are going to come out swinging. I think they both cut weight to get down to 265, so maybe on...
No, I think he weighed in at 250. I think he was good.
Did he? I thought Sherdog has him listed at 265, but hey, regardless, these guys are definitely on the bigger spectrum for the heavyweight division. So definitely definitely tune in for this one. It's going to be a banger. And that's followed up by our next fight, Jeremy Stephens against Calvin Kattar. This is an interesting one because I think this is a lot like Ryan Spann and Sam Alvey in the sense that Jeremy Stephens is that gatekeeper to see if somebody's legit and is ready to fight those top-ranked opponents. And Calvin Kattar is a guy who... I think a lot of people are sleeping on. He was a short notice replacement for his UFC debut. He's done extremely well since, and then his last fight with Zabit, who is everyone's kind of hyping Zabit up as that next guy who's going to go on that really long title run.
One of those guys.
And Cater was a guy who, yes, he lost to Zabit, but remember, that went from a 5-round fight to a 3-round fight. And
I remember that fight.
And Zabit, yes, Zabit looked terrible in that 3rd round. So if that would have went all 5 rounds, you could make a really good argument that Cater would have won that fight. Yeah.
Yep. I do remember, like, when you said that, I do remember that fight. We're all me and a good friend of mine, shout out to Jason Murray. We were looking at that fight, and, like, as we're looking, like, I've never seen Zabit look this tired in the 3rd round. And, like, maybe it was a bad day, maybe it was whatever, but I think they were, like, I forgot who said that, someone, like, he gasses in, like, those long rounds. And I think his manager was, like, reduced down, like you said, reduced from a 5-round fight to a 3-round fight. And we were like, I don't know if he's ready for Max right now. I'm definitely on the hype train, don't get me wrong. I love Zabit. He comes from a kung fu background just like I do. Like, I love watching Zabit fight. If you watch the highlight reel, he looks phenomenal. But the fact that Calvin kept on, like, it was really, like, was really putting pressure on him, really tagging him up in that 3rd round. Even in the 2nd round a little bit. But, like, you can tell, like, the experience is there. He looked really sharp that last fight.
Yeah. And Cater, he's a relatively big favorite in this fight. I think right now he's at minus 245, and for good reason. You know, even though the Jeremy Stevens is ranked 7th and Cater's 9th, I give Cater a lot of momentum going into this fight, knowing that he almost knocked off who a lot of people are claiming that next elite champion. And like I said, Jeremy Stevens, he's been around the game for a while. He's a pretty reckless striker, so there's always the chance that Cater gets caught. But Cater's extremely well-rounded. As we saw, he has the cardio to go all 3 rounds. And he might have chalked that last fight up with Zabib as a learning lesson, saying, hey, I have to do more in the 2nd round to win that round. You know, he probably ended that fight with some left in the gas tank, so maybe we see a new Cater this fight where he digs a little bit deeper in the 2nd round because now he's confident that he's going to be able to give the majority of his energy in the 3rd round. Yeah, but yeah, I would go Cater in this one.
Yeah, I agree.
All right, so this next fight. All right, to give everyone a little context into this fight, so we kind of got you excited for Greg Hardy against Yorgan De Castro. This next fight is actually one that I anticipate a lot more than that fight. So it's Francis Ngannou against Biggie Boy Rosenstrike. All right, so these are 2 guys, 2 deep African guys, even though I think Ngannou is from France.
I think he's from Africa. I think his story is like he worked in a salt mine when he was like a child. Like, he has some crazy backstory. I don't know how true.
Yeah, he worked in a salt mine, and then I'm pretty sure he ended up in France. So
probably
people are going to be listening to this podcast being like, all right, that's an interesting story enough to tune in. All right, so these guys, from a knockout power perspective, they might be 1 and 2 in the heavyweight division. Francis Ngannou, you kind of see what Deontay Wilder does in boxing. Francis does the exact same thing in MMA, except he doesn't need a lot of strikes to do it. He's a guy that literally he could throw 1 punch and win with that 1 single punch. And coming out the gate, Francis, there was a lot of hype behind him until he fought the champion Stipe Miocic, which we talked about a little bit earlier. Champions, they are very smart fighters. They implement their game plans. And basically, Stipe out-wrestled him for the entire fight.
That is how you fight everyone who fights who hits like that.
Yes, and to be very honest, that is how everyone should fight like that. Except Rosenstrike does not have that same skill set where he's going to be able to take Francis to the ground. He's going to have to stand and bang with him, but at the same time, he has... I mean, we haven't seen that many fights with Rosenstrike, but we know the power is immense with him. We don't know if he hits as hard as Francis, but he's in that same caliber where 1 strike might end the fight just based off that 1 strike.
Right.
I'm super hyped for
quite a few kickboxing fights too, though.
Yes.
So like he's a very technical, very accomplished striker, but
so I'm going to go Francis just because I think that he has his mind straight going into this, and, he's kind of been in that UFC limelight before. He's learned from it, and you've kind of seen him going on that tear since then, outside of the Derek Lewis fight. So I think this is going to be an early knockout for Francis, even though there's a possibility that he could get knocked out. I'm hoping that this is not a repeat of Francis against Derek Lewis, where they essentially looked at each other for. Was that a 25 or a 15-minute fight?
I don't remember.
Well, regardless, there were more minutes in that fight than strikes thrown. It was the most boring thing in the world because they were both afraid of their power. But like I said, I think Francis has learned from his loss to Stipe. He's learned from that loss to Derek Lewis. He has his head right, and. I think this is going to be a bad night for Rosenstrike.
Yeah, I think especially since Francis just has momentum. Like he's just been on the tear lately. He's kind of essentially like talking to town and let's say that talking to town and it's not going to be. Well, we know this for a fact. It's not going to be a long fight. If it does go the distance because it gassed out in the first round, then could go the last two rounds, but.
Yeah, this fight would be terrible if it lasted like more than a minute through the second round, just because I think it's going to turn into a repeat of Francis and Derek Lewis. But from a betting perspective, if you're playing fantasy, I would definitely hedge this fight. You want exposure to both guys, but from a straight-up betting perspective, I'm not confident to put some money on Francis's high odds at this point. If you did want to play it risky, feel free to throw some money on Rosenstrike. But where I believe the safe bet would be is that this is not going the full 15 minutes. Whatever those odds are, just put a lot of money on that because this could be over relatively quick. And like I said, it could literally end with one strike thrown. If that strike goes through and connects properly, that could be the end of the fight. Because even if you look at Francis's previous fights, I think the most that he's connected with on the feet is like 22 significant strikes or something. Which seems incredible given his power, but yeah, this fight's not going to go very long, so just take the safe bet and say this one's not going to go to the decision. All right, so we've got you hyped up for a couple heavyweight fights. Next up, we have the bantamweight title bout, which we talked about a little bit earlier that came out of nowhere. Henry Cejudo, an extremely accomplished Olympic wrestler. He's currently
the most accomplished fighter in MMA right now.
Yeah, he currently holds 2 of the UFC belts, and like we said,
got stripped from him though.
Okay.
Yes. Because they were supposed to fight for a 125 pound belt a couple months ago. I was actually at that event, but the guy didn't make weight, so that got. But he did get stripped for the 125.
Yeah.
Essentially, he had both at the same time though. He did have.
Yeah, my fault. Well, this guy, he's the last champion in that division, and then he's the current bantamweight title holder.
Right.
And we already kind of gave you a little preface with this. Dominic Cruz, an extremely good fighter from back in the day. Former champion himself. He had a pretty good title reign. But like I said, he's only fought 6 times in the past 9 years. He's coming off a 4-year layoff. And this came as a complete surprise. Like, when I first heard this fight, I was like... What? Dominic Cruz? He's an analyst. When you hear Dominic Cruz's name, you think of him as an analyst, not an actual fighter.
True.
Like
next to Joe Rogan and
Yeah, so like when this came out, I was like, wow, this is really entertaining. You just had a guy who held 2 belts against another guy who hasn't fought in 4 years. That's very interesting. Dominic, he's a great fighter, real diverse. He has some unique striking, but I don't see his path to victory in this one. Yeah, just that long layoff. Cejudo's hot right now, and Cejudo's actually turning into a really good striker at this point in time with some good knockout power. And there's always that wrestling that he can fall back on. So I think this is going to be a real long night for Dominic Cruz. I could see it going all 5 rounds, but I would see Cejudo either winning 4 or 5 of those rounds.
Agreed. Yeah, I agree. I mean, if you're going to put money on it,
Yeah, definitely throw it Cejudo's way. You know, even
hard Dominic Cruz fan. Go for it.
yeah, even though Cruz, you know, he's such a big underdog, I still don't see a lot of value. I because Dominic doesn't even have that knockout power either. So
Right.
I don't think he's going to connect with Cejudo and he goes to sleep off that. I think he's actually going to have to outwork him for 3 rounds, which I just don't see it. All right, so that's number 1 of the title fights. Next up, we have our main event, which, oh man, this main event has gone all over the place. So for people who don't know this backstory, Tony Ferguson is one of the most unorthodox fighters in UFC and probably one of the biggest characters as well. A real out there guy, to say the least, but he's an amazing fighter. Extremely unorthodox, but it's effective. And typically in his fights, he brings violence and a go-forward approach that never stops. His conditioning is amazing. Like, this guy will fight for 25 minutes, and it looks like he could go for another 25 minutes. Like, there's very little drop-off from how he looks in round 1 to round 5. But with that being said, originally he was slated to fight Khabib Nurmagomedov, which, in my opinion, is the most dominant guy out there right now. That fight has fallen through, 5 times now? It's... yeah, so...
I don't even know, but that fight is cursed.
Yeah, so what was it? Khabib originally didn't make weight. He had to be hospitalized. Tony, he tears his ACL.
Tony tripped over a wire.
Doing an interview. And now we have Corona. So
Corona, yeah.
I think for the UFC, it would just be good for humanity just not to book that fight again because a meteor might be coming through that. But with that being said, he's going up against Justin Gaethje, which is a guy who kind of has that same fighting style. He's going to bring it to you. Extremely violent guy. The only difference between him and Tony?
Groundwork.
I wasn't even going to say groundwork. Tony is much better with the submissions, and Gaethje does have that wrestling background, just like Tony does.
Right.
But conditioning. Gaethje gasses pretty much every single fight that he's in. And he's another guy, I think, that all the wars that he's been in, it's taken his toll on the body, and that's the wrong recipe going up against Tony Ferguson. So maybe... Yeah, I mean, Gaethje has ridiculous knockout power. I think that's going to be his best path to victory. But if this goes over 2 rounds, I just see Tony almost a lock to win those last 3 rounds if it goes the distance, just because of that conditioning differential between the two.
Right. No, I mean, yeah. He is the boogeyman for a reason. Tony doesn't have that one-hit knockout power. Like, he's not knocking you out with one punch in the first round, but he will beat the hell out of you. Like, you'll look like a mess.
He reminds me a lot of Max Holloway. It's not power, it's volume.
Right. And it's like, you're like, oh, it doesn't hurt him, like, until you see the other guy's face. Like, when you fought Cowboy, Don Cerrone, we fought Cowboy.
Yeah. If you have a broken nose, do not blow your nose. That's the one thing that everybody learned from that fight.
I didn't even know that fact until I saw that fight.
I was told about it, but I didn't actually know that would happen. You know, like, I assumed that it was like, oh, it would just make the bleeding more, but I didn't know that your face would actually balloon up like that, so...
I didn't know that either.
That was a lesson that we can all take to the grave, because that's an image that we're probably not going to be able to get out of our mind in this lifetime.
Yeah.
All right, so you're going Tony 2 on this one?
Yeah.
All right, so the winner of this fight, what's up next? Khabib after he's done with Ramadan, or McGregor?
I don't want to see him fight McGregor. Not yet. I want that Tony Khabib fight to happen. And McGregor is just kind of... You know what I don't want to see? I don't want to see a Tony and... I don't want to see a Khabib and McGregor fight again.
No,
I want to see Tony and Khabib fight first.
I would love for Khabib and McGregor to happen again, just as a betting guy. I'd probably put my life savings on Khabib because it's literally going to be the exact same thing. Maybe McGregor doesn't get knocked down again this time, but it's going to be the exact same thing again. And this fight actually sets up like a weird situation because this could be possible. The winner between Tony and Justin faces Khabib. The loser faces McGregor, and that would still be a huge fight.
Right. So, like, one is you go for the title, the other one you get probably the biggest payday of your career.
Yeah, because even though McGregor's last fight was at 170 against a beat-up Cowboy Cerrone, I don't think that he stands a chance with competing with the upper echelon guys in 170. Like, if he went up against Kamaru Usman, that would look extremely similar to that fight against Khabib. Except now, instead of fighting... you think he has a chance against Kamaru?
Oh, no, I think it's just going to be worse than Khabib. I think he might actually get knocked out.
Well, that's what I was saying, is that...
he got... The powers is different. Everything's different.
He got held down by Khabib, a 155 guy. You know, what's Kamaru going to do? He's a huge guy that cuts down to 170 with that same wrestling background. Even though it's more wrestling-based than the Sambo-based that Khabib tends to implement, I think that's even going to be worse. And Kamaru, he would have no intention. He's not an ego guy. He's not going to stand on his feet and try to trade with McGregor. I could see him instantly going in for a takedown. And unless we have like a situation where it's like Masvidal against Askren,
and man, let's be honest, Askren, I don't know where he picked that out. I guess he was the winner within, that's fine, but he was walking at head first with his arms out. He was asking to get knee in the face. It was only a matter of time.
Yeah, and since we're trying to gear this podcast towards new viewers for UFC, that's your homework. So you have two things to look up on YouTube. Anthony Pettis and that jump kick against Benson Henderson, and the Jorge Masvidal versus Ben Askren knee. So for anyone that says MMA is an extremely violent sport, they're not doing anything to not support their cause by showing those two videos. The Masvidal-Askren knockout, that was one of the most brutal ones of all time. And that Pettis against Benson Henderson, even though it wasn't a knockout, that was still pretty awesome just to see that based on his athleticism. But, yeah, I mean, we're back. I'm just so pumped that these fights are going to go on. We have the opening card next Saturday, and then I believe they have another card that Wednesday, and then another one the following Saturday. So UFC, they're definitely going to be playing catch-up, trying to get all these cards out as soon as possible.
So here's my question. I haven't looked this up yet. Are we supposed to pay for that card on Wednesday, too?
No, I believe that's an ESPN one.
Oh, perfect. Okay.
Yeah, I think actually the next few after next Saturday's card are going to be fight night cards as opposed to actual pay-per-views.
There we go.
But those are still going to be... They still have some pretty good fights sprinkled in there. But like I said, the UFC, they're playing catch-up right now. They're trying to get back on schedule, get these fights that were canceled on the books. And lucky for us, you know, it's going to be action-packed days for the next foreseeable future. Just because now that they have that deal with ESPN, they got to show something. All right.
That's going to be exciting.
Yep, definitely. All right, so that's everything for next week's card. You got anything else, Jebari? Anything else that people who might be tuning in for the first time should be paying attention to?
And guys, please remember, MMA is a martial arts competition. That's all it is. It's a martial arts competition that can take place on the feet, on the ground, or where have you. And that's the best way to look at it. That's the best way to watch MMA. And if you really want to appreciate the sport as a fan, that's the way to watch it. Don't look at it don't think of it like you would pro wrestling, where you just want to see people get hit, violence, things like that. It's like, it is a martial arts competition. It's just very honest about who's the better fighter. That night.
Yeah, and like I said, I think this is going to be a real good card for that introduction because we do have some bangers. We do have Francis against Rosenstrike, Hardy against De Castro, but at the same time, we have some that might turn into grappling affairs. Olynyk against Verdum, Rosa against Mitchell. So this card really has something for everyone, and you know, this might be a good primer to figure out what you actually enjoy the most. Obviously, knockouts, that's what a lot of people gravitate towards, but hey, you might be a fan of wrestling and you get interested in the jiu-jitsu component that you see in some of these fights. And to be completely honest, even if we look at that main fight, Ferguson against Gaethje, that could go anywhere. That could be a good representation as to what martial arts is all about. Starts out in the feet, somebody gets a takedown, somebody threatens with submissions. Shit, Ferguson might actually do something crazy like pull guard. that's never really been tested with Gaethje. Ferguson.
Yeah, that's a very strong possibility. He might actually pull guard. That would be.
I mean, if the guy throws elbows from off his back and actually does damage, he's likely to do anything. But like I said, I think this is a great card for anybody who wants to tune in and definitely get people interested in the sport. There's nothing else going on, so what else are you going to do next Saturday night, right?
Yep.
All right. Definitely appreciate the time, Jebari. Any shout-outs you want to do before we wrap things up?
Shout out to Hero MMA Academy. That's where I teach at. Shout out to my coach, Demian Kirby. Shout out to Crazy 88, Elkridge. Shout out to 4 MMA in Frederick, Maryland. All these places are in Maryland, by the way. And that's pretty much it for right now.
Awesome. Well, definitely appreciate you taking the time. And to anyone who's listening, thank you very much for listening. And hopefully you have as much fun next Saturday night as we do.
Yep.
Awesome. Thanks, my man.